The afternoon I drove to Mercy General, the sky was the kind of pale gray that makes everything feel already over. I remember gripping the steering wheel and telling myself not to cry before I even got inside. I had cried enough. I had cried in the shower, in the car, in the hospital bathroom with the faucet running so nobody would hear. There was nothing left, I thought. Nothing left to do and nothing left to feel. My mother had been in that hospital for 11 days. I know people say that about their mothers all the time, that she was the strongest person they ever knew, that she was the heart of the family, that the world made less sense without her in it. I used to roll my eyes a little when I heard that. Not because I didn't love my mother, but because I thought love like that was something you only understood when you were older. When you had lived enough to know what it meant to lose something irreplaceable. I was 31 years old, and I understood it now. Her name was Carol. She was 58, which everyone kept saying was too young, as if that made it more tragic than it already was. She had been a middle school art teacher for 26 years in Cedar Falls, Iowa. She wore paint-stained cardigans and kept a collection of ceramic mugs she refused to throw away even when the handles broke off. She made the best chicken and rice soup I have ever tasted, and she hummed while she cooked, always slightly off-key, always the same 3 songs on rotation. She had raised me alone after my father left when I was 4. She had worked 2 jobs for 6 years to save enough to buy us a house with a real backyard. She had never once, in all the years I was growing up, made me feel like I was a burden she was carrying. She was my whole life. And she was dying. The diagnosis had come 8 months earlier. Acute myeloid leukemia. The kind that moves fast and doesn't negotiate. She had done 1 round of chemotherapy and responded well enough that her oncologist, Dr. Harmon, had used the word hopeful in a way that made me write it down in my phone just so I could look at it later. Hopeful. I had built an entire future on that word. I had pictured her at my wedding someday, at a kitchen table with grandchildren she hadn't met yet, in the backyard of her house on Clover Street, watching the fireflies she loved come out in July. Then her counts dropped. Then they dropped again. Dr. Harmon stopped using the word hopeful and started using words like aggressive and resistant and limited options. The only path forward, he explained, was a bone marrow transplant. Without it, he gave her 6 months, maybe less. Finding a donor match for bone marrow is not like finding a blood donor. It's not something you can ask your friends to do at a drive-through clinic on a Saturday morning. The markers have to align in ways that are almost impossibly specific, and for patients without siblings or close biological relatives, the search can take months and still come up empty. My mother was an only child. Her parents had both passed. I was her only family, and I had been tested immediately I was not a match. The National Registry search began in February. By April, we had 3 potential candidates. All 3 fell through for different reasons. One had a medical condition that disqualified him. One had moved internationally and couldn't be reached in time. One was a match, but withdrew consent after speaking with her own doctor about the risks. I didn't blame her, I couldn't. But I sat in my car after that phone call and screamed until my throat hurt. My mother, through all of this, was calmer than I was. That was the thing about her that undid me the most. She was not in denial. She knew exactly what was happening, and she had made peace with it in some quiet interior way that I could not access no matter how hard I tried. She kept her ceramic mugs on the windowsill of her hospital room. She asked the nurses their names on the first day and remembered them afterward. She told me, more than once, that she didn't want me to stop living while she was sick. Go to work, she'd say. See your friends. Eat something that isn't vending machine food, for the love of God. I didn't listen. I drove to Cedar Falls every weekend and stayed through Monday. I took 3 weeks of remote work accommodations from my job in Des Moines. I researched experimental trials at 2 in the morning and sent emails to specialists in other states and read every paper I could find on matched unrelated donor protocols and haploidentical transplants. I became fluent in a language I had never wanted to learn. None of it helped. By May, Dr. Harmon sat me down in his office, not the hallway, the actual office, which I had learned by then was always a bad sign, and explained that my mother's condition had progressed faster than anticipated. The window for a transplant was narrowing. If a donor wasn't identified in the next few weeks, she would no longer be a candidate for the procedure at all. I went home that night and sat on my kitchen floor for a long time. I thought about calling someone. A friend, my cousin in Tucson, anyone. But I didn't know what I would say. My mother is dying and there is nothing left to try didn't feel like something I could hand to another person. It felt like something I had to carry alone, in the dark, on a kitchen floor, until I figured out how to stand up again. I stood up eventually. I always did. That was the thing my mother had taught me without ever saying it in so many words, you stand up. Not because it gets easier. Not because the weight lifts. But because staying down doesn't do anything for anybody, least of all yourself. So I stood up, and I drove back to Cedar Falls the next morning, and I walked into my mother's room with a clean face and a coffee I had bought her from the place on Maple that she liked, and I sat down next to her bed and held her hand and talked about ordinary things. Her students. The garden she was going to plant when she got home. The mug she wanted to find at the antique market in Ames. She knew. She always knew when I was not okay. She squeezed my hand and said, "Whatever happens, I need you to know that my life was full. You filled it up. You did that." I excused myself to use the restroom because I refused to cry in front of her. On the afternoon that everything changed, I had just come from one of the hardest conversations of my life. Dr. Harmon had confirmed what I already knew in my bones: the registry search had been officially suspended. There were no viable candidates remaining. My mother was transitioning to comfort-focused care, which was a gentle and clinical way of saying that we were no longer trying to cure her. We were trying to make the time she had left as good as it could be. I had sat with her for 2 hours after that. We didn't talk about it much. We watched half of a nature documentary she liked, the one about the national parks, and she fell asleep during the segment about Glacier, and I sat there watching her breathe. Every breath a small mercy. Every exhale a thing I was not ready to count. When I finally stood to leave, she was still sleeping. I brushed her hair back from her forehead the way she used to do to me when I was small. I kissed her cheek. I whispered that I loved her and that I would be back in the morning and that she should sleep well. Then I walked out of her room, down the corridor, and into the elevator. In the lobby, I stopped at the small family waiting area near the main entrance, a cluster of chairs and a low table with a box of tissues that was always half empty. I sat down because my legs were not entirely cooperative. The lobby had that particular hospital quality of being busy and silent at the same time, people moving through it with the careful expressions of people trying to hold themselves together in a public space. I was looking at nothing. Just the middle distance. That was when I heard them. 2 nurses were standing maybe 15 feet away, near the reception desk, talking in the low voices that people use when they're having a personal conversation in a professional setting. I wasn't trying to listen. I was too hollowed out to be curious about anything. But the lobby was quiet enough and they were close enough that the words floated over to me anyway. "It's the strangest thing. Because she doesn't even know he's here." He checked in under his father's last name, apparently. "What do you mean she doesn't know?" "She's been a patient here for almost 2 weeks, and he checked in 2 days ago." He only mentioned it because he asked the floor coordinator if there were other long-term patients in oncology. He said he'd been trying to find her for years. I didn't move. Find who? His birth mother. He was adopted at birth, apparently. He said he got a DNA match through one of those ancestry sites about a year ago and followed it here, to Cedar Falls. He's been looking for her. A long pause. I was not breathing. "And the patient he's been asking about, what's her name?" The name they said was my mother's name. I stood up so fast the chair scraped against the floor and both nurses looked over. I don't know what my face looked like. I know it scared them, because one of them took a half step back. I apologized immediately and held up both hands, and then I said the only thing I could think to say, which was, "I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to listen, but I'm her daughter." That patient. I'm her daughter. There was a moment of professional hesitation, the nurses exchanging a look, the brief consideration of privacy protocol, and then one of them, the older one with silver-streaked hair, seemed to make a decision. "His name is Marcus," she said carefully. "He's in room 214. Internal medicine, second floor. He came in 2 days ago with a cardiac event. He's stable, he's going to be fine. But he asked about your mother, and I think..." She paused. "I think you should probably go talk to him." I took the stairs. I don't know why. I think I needed to be moving. Room 214 was at the end of a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and fresh linen. The door was half open. I knocked anyway. "Come in." He was sitting up in the bed, which surprised me somehow. I had been expecting something more dramatic, someone hooked to machines, someone visibly fragile. Instead, I saw a man who looked maybe 40, with my mother's coloring, which hit me like a physical thing the moment I registered it. Dark eyes. The particular line of the jaw. He was broad-shouldered and wore a hospital gown with the particular indignity that everyone wears hospital gowns, and he was holding a paperback novel that he set down the second he saw my face. "Are you Carol's daughter?" he asked. I couldn't speak for a moment. I just stood there in the doorway looking at him. "My name is Sarah," I finally said. "Yes." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, there was something in his expression I recognized because I had been wearing it for months. The specific look of someone who has been hoping for something so long, they've almost stopped believing it could actually arrive. "My name is Marcus Webb," he said. "I was born Marcus Larson, 38 years ago, in Des Moines. I was placed for adoption 6 days after I was born." He stopped, steadied himself. "I think your mother is my birth mother." I sat down in the chair next to his bed because standing was no longer something I could guarantee. His story came out in pieces, unhurried, the way you tell something important to someone you have only just met, but who you somehow already know matters. He had been adopted by a couple in Wisconsin, good people, a happy childhood by his own account. He was careful to say that, careful to make it clear he was not carrying bitterness, just questions. He had always known he was adopted. He had always wondered about the woman who had given birth to him and then, for reasons he didn't know, had decided she couldn't keep him. He had submitted a DNA sample to an ancestry platform 14 months ago on something of an impulse, not expecting much. 3 weeks later, he had gotten a hit, a partial match, suggesting a biological relative in Iowa. The matching profile had a name. Carol Hensley. No photo, no other information. He had searched for her. He had found her address in Cedar Falls. He had driven there twice, parked outside the house on Clover Street, and not been able to make himself knock. "I kept thinking she might not want to be found," he said. "I kept thinking that if she had wanted to find me, she would have." His voice was quiet and careful in the way of someone who has rehearsed being composed. "And then I found out she was sick. I found out from a neighbor. Actually, I knocked on the house next door instead of hers, and the woman there told me Carol was in the hospital. Had been for weeks. He had come to Cedar Falls and checked himself in for a cardiac evaluation he had been postponing for months, telling himself it was practical. But I understood, sitting there, that what he had really come to do was be in the same building as her. To be close to something he had spent his whole life at a distance from. "I didn't know if I had any right to introduce myself," he said. "I still don't know if I do." I looked at him for a long time. "She never told me," I said. "She never told me she had another child." "I know." "She was 18, I said, not because I knew this for certain, but because the math put her there and because I was trying to build something out of the fragments in real time. "She would have been 18. 17, he said quietly. According to the records I was able to access. 17 years old, alone in a way I couldn't fully imagine, making a decision I had no right to judge. My mother. The woman who had hummed off-key in the kitchen and kept broken mugs and put every piece of herself into raising me. She had been a teenager who had faced something enormous and made the only choice she could see at the time, and then she had lived her entire life with that weight, and she had never told me, and I understood suddenly and completely why she hadn't. Some things are not secrets because you are ashamed. Some things are not secrets because you are hiding. Some things are simply the most private room in the house, the one you keep locked not to deceive anyone, but because you have never found a way to open the door without everything inside spilling out at once. I said, I need to tell you something about why it matters that you're here. I told him about the leukemia. I told him about the bone marrow search. I told him about the 3 candidates who had fallen through, about Dr. Harmon's office, about the decision that had been made that afternoon to move to comfort care. I told him all of it plainly, without breaking down, because breaking down was something I could do later, and right now there was something more important happening. He listened without interrupting. His hands, I noticed, had gone still on the bed beside him. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. I would like to be tested, he said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He met my eyes. I want to. I went to find Dr. Harmon. What followed was not instantaneous or cinematic. Real medicine doesn't work that way, and I want to be honest about that. There were conversations and protocols and the careful explanation that a sibling match, while statistically more promising, was not a guarantee. The testing itself took 2 days. I did not sleep much during those 2 days. I sat with my mother and talked to her about small things and told her there was something I needed to tell her, and then found, every time, that I didn't know how to start. I told her on the second evening. I sat in the chair by her bed while the light went gold through the hospital window, and I told her that there was a man on the 2nd floor of this building. That his name was Marcus. That he believed, and I believed, and the DNA evidence suggested, that he was the son she had placed for adoption 38 years ago. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, "Is he okay?" And I started crying, finally. For the first time in front of her, because of course that was the first thing she asked. Of course it was. Not about herself, not about the implications, not about what this meant for any of it. Just, "Is he okay?" "He's okay," I said. "He wants to meet you." She turned her face toward the window. I watched her profile, the line of her jaw that I now recognized from somewhere else, and I saw something move across her expression that I didn't have a name for. Something old and heavy. Settling differently after a very long time. "Tell him yes," she said. He came to her room the next morning. I stood in the hallway outside and let them have that first moment without me. I don't know exactly what was said. She told me later, in pieces, over several conversations, that she had apologized, that he had told her she didn't need to, that they had cried together, and then laughed at something she couldn't remember, the way you sometimes do, after you've been crying. That he had held her hand and told her that his life had been good, and that he didn't carry anger, and that he had just wanted to know where he came from. That she had told him, "You came from love." That was the only reason I did what I did. You came from love, and I have thought about you every year of my life since. The test results came back on a Friday. Marcus was a match. Not a partial match. Not a close enough match with caveats and asterisks. A match the kind that made Dr. Harmon go very quiet on the phone for a moment before he said anything. The kind that a transplant coordinator later described to me as exceptionally rare in unrelated donors and nearly unheard of in previously unknown family members identified this late in a search. The kind that makes you believe, a little, in something larger than coincidence. Marcus was cleared for donation within the week. His cardiac situation was monitored carefully and declared stable enough. He underwent the harvest procedure without complications. He joked, afterward, in recovery, that it was the least dramatic medical experience he'd had all month. I liked him enormously by then. I liked the way he talked to my mother. I liked that he had flown his wife, a woman named Diane, out from Wisconsin so she could be there, and that Diane hugged me in the hospital corridor like she already knew me. My mother received the transplant in early June. The first weeks were brutal in the way that bone marrow transplants are always brutal, the body rejecting and then slowly, cautiously, beginning to accept. There were setbacks. There were nights when Dr. Harmon's voice was careful in a way that meant be prepared. I sat in waiting rooms and held cups of coffee that went cold and talked to Marcus and Diane in the low voices of people keeping vigil together. But she was tough. My mother was so unbelievably tough. By August, she was sitting up and eating real food and had reclaimed the windowsill for her ceramic mugs, which I had brought from Clover Street at her specific request. By September, she walked the length of the corridor twice without stopping. The transplant coordinator, a woman named Britta, who had become something like a friend by then, used a word I recognized. Hopeful. I wrote it down again. The day we drove her home from Mercy General, it was late October, and the maples along the highway had gone the particular fierce orange that Iowa does in the fall, the kind that looks almost aggressively beautiful, like the trees are trying to say something important before winter comes. My mother sat in the passenger seat and watched the countryside go by, and she hummed one of her 3 songs, slightly off-key. And I drove and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying for itself. Marcus and Diane came to Cedar Falls for Thanksgiving that year. We had dinner at my mother's house on Clover Street, around a table that was not quite big enough for all of us, and we ate too much and talked too loud, and at one point, my mother made everyone stop so she could say something, and we went quiet. And she looked around the table at me, at Marcus, at Diane, at my friend Kelsey, who I had invited because I didn't want her to be alone, and she said, "I spent a long time thinking about what I lost. I think I want to start thinking about what I have." Marcus nodded. He had the same jaw as her, the same dark eyes. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. I thought about how close it had come. How I had been sitting in that lobby with nothing left, listening to nothing, and the right words had drifted to me across a quiet room. How a man had followed a thread for 14 months and ended up in the right building at the right time. How my mother, who had carried a secret for 38 years, had finally been given a door she could open. You can call it coincidence. You can call it luck or probability or the random kindness of the universe distributing things unevenly. I'm not going to argue about what it was. I only know what it felt like. It felt like the moment right before dawn when you can't see it yet, but you can feel the dark starting to change, that quiet, certain shift that tells you morning is coming, whether you're ready for it or not. My mother is still here. She has her mugs on the windowsill and her paint-stained cardigans and her soup that I will never be able to replicate, no matter how many times she writes the recipe down for me. She has a son she didn't know she would ever see again, and a daughter-in-law who calls her on Sunday mornings, and a granddaughter, Marcus's youngest, 5 years old, named Eva, who crawled into her lap the first time they met and stayed there for an hour without explanation, the way children do when they recognize something important in a person. She has her garden back. She planted it late last spring, later in the season than she wanted to, but it came in anyway: tomatoes and zinnias and that particular type of basil she likes. The kind that smells like summer all the way from the back steps. And some evenings, when I drive up from Des Moines and let myself in through the back door, I can hear her before I even see her, humming in the kitchen, slightly off-key, always the same 3 songs. And I stand there in the doorway and I just listen for a moment before I let her know I'm there. Because I know now, in a way I didn't know before, that ordinary moments are not ordinary at all. They are the whole thing, they are every bit of it. And I am not going to miss a single one.